I bought a small ground-floor condo in August 2021 after getting out of an abusive relationship. My ex had stalked me for months after we broke up. One night, he assaulted me and strangled me badly enough that the state pressed charges against him. I already had a restraining order, but I never updated it with my new address because I didn't want him knowing where I'd moved. I thought the condo would finally be a fresh start. It wasn't. About a month after moving in, I was sitting on the couch FaceTiming my best friend. The condo wasn't very big. The living room connected to a small office that used to be a back porch. The office had a sliding glass door leading outside, and I kept a thick wooden dowel in the track so nobody could force it open. Halfway through our conversation, I heard a loud bang from the office. Not a little tap. It sounded exactly like someone had shoved the sliding door as hard as they could. I froze. My friend immediately asked, "What was that?" "I think someone's trying to get in." I ended the call, ran into the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and headed toward the front door. Before I got there, the doorbell rang. I nearly dropped the knife. I looked through the peephole and saw the guy I'd been seeing for a few weeks. I'd completely forgotten I had invited him over that night. The second I opened the door, I asked if he'd been messing with the back door. He looked confused. "What? No." I asked him again. "No, I literally just got here." One look at my face and he knew something was wrong. He took the knife from me, grabbed another one from the kitchen, and told me to stay behind him while he checked the office. A few seconds later, I heard him say, "Call the police." I ran over. The sliding door wasn't fully closed anymore. The wooden dowel was still in the track, but the door had been forced open just enough to slam into it. That was the bang I'd heard. Then we noticed something else. My water bottle had been sitting on my desk inside the office before I got home from work. Now it was lying outside on the patio. Neither of us touched anything after that. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. They searched around the condo first before coming inside. One officer checked every room, while another walked the outside of the building with a flashlight. A few minutes later, he called the others over. There were large footprints in the dirt beneath my bedroom window. Not just one, several. Then they found large handprints on the outside of the bedroom window. It looked like whoever had been there tried the bedroom first, before moving to the back sliding door. The officers compared the prints to the guy I was dating and immediately ruled him out. The footprints were much larger than his, and so were the handprints. One of the officers asked if anyone had a reason to target me. I told him about my ex, about the stalking, about the restraining order, about how I'd moved without telling anyone where I was going. He wrote everything down but couldn't say whether the two were connected. Before leaving, the officers told me to upgrade my security. I didn't waste any time. Within a week, I'd installed security cameras, window alarms, door alarms, stronger dowels, motion lights, and security signs on every window. I wasn't taking any chances. For a while, nothing happened. Months went by without a single problem. Then one night, my boyfriend and I were watching TV when I happened to look toward the office window. Someone was standing outside. He wasn't right against the glass. He was standing near the side of the building, just far enough away that I couldn't make out his face. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't walking anywhere. He was just standing there. I nudged my boyfriend and pointed toward the window. By the time he looked over, the man started walking away. My boyfriend opened the front door and stepped outside, but by the time he got around the corner, whoever it was had disappeared. I checked the security camera afterward. Nothing. The camera covered almost the entire front of the condo. Whoever that man was had somehow stayed just outside its field of view. That was the moment I started worrying again. If that had been my ex, then somehow he'd found me. For the next couple of weeks, nothing happened. I wanted to believe I'd overreacted. I kept telling myself it was probably just some random guy who happened to be standing outside. The camera hadn't caught him. There wasn't any proof he'd even been looking at my condo, and I was probably letting everything that happened with my ex get into my head. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every night before bed, I'd check every window and door. My boyfriend started doing the same thing without me even asking. We'd make sure the alarms were armed, the dowels were in place, and the cameras were recording. Eventually, it just became part of our routine. Then one Friday night, everything changed. We were sitting on the couch watching TV when a deafening crash came from the office. For a split second, I honestly had no idea what had happened. Then I heard glass hitting the floor. I turned around and saw the entire back window shattered. A brick was lying in the middle of the office. My heart fucking dropped. Before I could even say anything, my boyfriend was already on his feet. "I'm going outside." "No, wait for the police." He didn't. He threw open the front door and sprinted toward the side of the building. I followed as far as the doorway, but wasn't about to run out there with whoever had just thrown a brick through our window. A few seconds later, I heard him yelling. By the time I reached the front walkway, he was pointing toward the parking lot. "There!" he shouted. I caught a glimpse of someone wearing a dark hoodie climbing into a white SUV. The dome light came on for just a second as the driver's door opened, but it wasn't enough to see his face. The engine started immediately. The SUV peeled out of the parking lot and disappeared before my boyfriend could get anywhere near it. He came back breathing hard, frustrated that he'd been so close. We called 911. The officers arrived within minutes. They photographed the broken window, collected the brick as evidence, and searched around the building with flashlights. He admitted there wasn't enough to identify anyone from a man in a hoodie driving a white SUV, but he told us to call immediately if we saw the vehicle again. After they left, neither of us got much sleep. Every tiny sound outside had us looking toward the windows. For the next few weeks, though, nothing happened. Eventually, life started feeling normal again. Looking back now, I think whoever it was realized we'd become too alert. So they waited, and they picked a day they thought I'd be completely alone. A few weeks later, my boyfriend had to leave early for work. Before he walked out the door, he did what had become our normal routine. He checked the front door, the back sliding door, and every window. Then he looked at me and said, "Don't open the door for anyone. I don't care who it is. I won't. You promise?" "I promise." He kissed me goodbye, locked the front door behind him, and left. I was exhausted, so I decided to go back to sleep. It was late morning, and I don't know how long I'd been asleep when something woke me. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not outside. Inside the condo. I sat up in bed and listened. Someone was walking through my living room. For a second, I actually thought my boyfriend had forgotten something and come back. I reached for my phone to check the time. He should have been at work by then. That's when my stomach fucking dropped. The bedroom door was already open, and from where I was sitting, I could see straight into part of the hallway. A man walked past. He was wearing a dark hoodie and dark jeans. He wasn't rushing. He was moving slowly, looking around like he genuinely believed nobody was home. I didn't make a sound. I slowly slid off the bed and crawled underneath it, clutching my phone so tightly my hands started cramping. From underneath the bed, I could still see through the open bedroom door. The man stopped in the living room. He picked something up from the table, turned it over in his hand for a second, then slipped it into his pocket. I remember thinking, he's stealing from me. Then he started walking toward the bedroom. Every step sounded louder than the last. He walked through the doorway and stopped only a few feet from the bed. I could only see him from the knees down. He stood there silently for what felt like forever. I was convinced he'd heard my breathing. My phone was still in my hand. I reached over with my thumb and turned the shutter sound off. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. When he turned slightly toward the dresser, I lifted the phone just enough and took a picture. He didn't react. A few seconds later, I took another, then another. On the last one, he turned just enough for me to see his face. The second I looked at the screen, I knew exactly who it was. It was my ex. I felt sick. Out of everyone in the world, it was him. He stayed in the bedroom for another minute or two, opening drawers and looking around before finally walking back into the hallway. I didn't move. I could still hear him walking through the condo. A cabinet opened, then another. A few moments later, I heard the front door open. Then it slammed shut. I stayed under the bed for another 5 minutes because I was too terrified to believe he was actually gone. Finally, I crawled out, locked myself in the bathroom, and called my boyfriend. I could barely get the words out. Then I called 911. The police searched the condo and the surrounding area, but he was gone. I showed them the photos I'd taken from underneath the bed. One of the officers immediately recognized him from the previous reports I'd made. The pictures were clear enough to identify him, and together with the restraining order and the earlier incidents, they finally had enough to move the investigation forward. A warrant was issued, and they later located his white SUV, the same type of vehicle my boyfriend had seen speeding away after the brick came through our window. Knowing it had really been him should have made me feel better. Instead, it left me with one question I've never been able to answer. If my ex had been the one coming back all that time, then whose footprints and handprints did the police find outside my condo the first time? Because the officers were certain those prints were much larger than his. And to this day, I still don't know who they belong to. When I was 14, I was babysitting my 3 younger cousins while my aunt and uncle were at a wedding. They lived in a really isolated part of Pennsylvania, up on the side of a mountain. Once it got dark, there wasn't another house or streetlight in sight. They were over an hour away, and since this was the early 2000s, all I had was their landline in case something happened. The baby was already asleep. The 4-year-old had fallen asleep watching TV, and my oldest cousin and I were upstairs playing Guitar Hero. The loft overlooked the driveway, which ended up being important. Their driveway split in 2. The left side was where everyone parked. The right side went down to the basement, but nobody ever drove down there because it was where the kids kept all their bikes and toys. It was around 10 that night when headlights suddenly lit up the window. At first, I thought my aunt and uncle had forgotten something and come back early. Then I realized the truck was turning down the basement driveway. I immediately knew something was wrong. Nobody used that driveway. I looked at my cousin and asked, "Do you know whose truck that is?" He looked for a second before shaking his head. "No, I've never seen that truck before." That was all I needed to hear. I got him downstairs as fast as I could, checked on the 2 younger kids, and picked up the landline. I was halfway through dialing 911 when I heard a loud metallic bang from downstairs. I froze. A second later, it happened again. Someone was trying to force open the garage door. Then they moved to the basement door. The handle started rattling over and over. They weren't knocking. They were trying to get inside. I locked the basement door, grabbed my cousin, and stayed on the phone with the dispatcher. She kept telling me to stay calm, but all I could think was that we were completely alone. The nearest deputy was at least 30 minutes away, and whoever was outside wasn't acting like they were at the wrong house. The dispatcher asked for my aunt and uncle's phone number so another operator could call them. I turned around to grab the piece of paper. That's when I saw him. Standing outside the sliding glass door was this huge guy with long red hair and a thick beard, just staring at me, and smiling. Not a normal smile either. It was the kind of smile that instantly told me something wasn't right. Behind him stood another man. He was just as tall, but I couldn't make out his face in the dark. I remember yelling, "Oh my God, they're here!" Before the dispatcher could even say anything, my cousin quietly said, "Mr. Jim?" I looked at him in complete shock. "You know him?" Before he could answer, I shouted through the glass, "I'm on the phone with the police." The smile disappeared. The man just stood there for a few seconds staring at me. Then he slowly backed away into the darkness. A moment later, I saw the truck back out of the driveway and disappear down the mountain road. I was still shaking when the truck disappeared. The dispatcher stayed on the phone with me the entire time. She asked me to describe the 2 men while another dispatcher called my aunt and uncle to tell them what was happening. I kept checking the sliding glass door, expecting them to come back. It felt like forever before the first deputy arrived. He searched around the house with a flashlight while another officer checked the basement and made sure nobody had gotten inside. Once they were sure the men were gone, they stayed with us until my aunt and uncle got home. The second they walked through the door, my uncle asked what happened. I was still trying to calm down, so my cousin answered first. It was Mr. Jim. The look on my uncle's face changed instantly. He knew exactly who he was talking about. He muttered, "I'm gonna fuck him up." My aunt immediately cut him off and told him to calm down. She was just as upset as he was and said Jim was never welcome back at the house. At the time, none of that made any sense to me. I figured maybe Mr. Jim had gone to the wrong house or was looking for my uncle. But the more I thought about it, the less that explanation fit. If he was looking for my uncle, why drive down the one driveway nobody ever used? Why try forcing open the garage door instead of knocking at the front door? None of it felt like a misunderstanding. Years later, I finally got an answer. My uncle had been struggling with a drug problem back then, something nobody in the family knew at the time. Mr. Jim wasn't just some random guy. He was someone my uncle knew through that. Whether he was there to confront my uncle, steal something, or something even worse, I'll never know. What I do know is this. He showed up in the middle of the night with another man. They tried getting into the basement, and they only left after realizing I was already on the phone with 911. I never babysat at that house again. And to this day, whenever I see headlights pulling into a driveway late at night, I still think about that smile. So, back in November 2020, I was in and out of hospital with some sickness, and on my way back, I had called the taxi to go home. But it would take about 30 to 40 minutes to get to me because it was a Saturday in a city. Since there was going to be a bit of a wait, I decided to sit down in a bench garden area just in front of the hospital. It was 3 a.m., about 0 degrees Celsius, and I had been awake for 36 hours at that point. My taxi was on its way, and I just sat cross-legged on the bench, headphones on, and nicotine keeping me alive. Everything was all fine until after 10 minutes, I noticed a guy very clearly walking directly towards me. He was stumbling a little bit, so I just assumed he was drunk. As he got on level with me, he stopped right in front of me and said something that I didn't hear. I looked up and said, "What?" Sorry, I had music on as I pulled them off, and he looked me dead in the eye and just said, "I could fucking batter you right now." Of everything I was expecting him to say, that wasn't on the list, so caught off guard, I tried just disarming him with humor by saying, "I don't doubt it." And every time I said that or something similar, he'd just say, "I could batter you. I want to deck you right here, right now, and I could take you in a fight," just to recall a few of them. After his anger had toned down, he sat on the bench next to me and started generally drunk rambling about his family and his friends, and, very specifically, his best friend's girlfriend that he was having an affair with. Then he pointed out my shoes, saying, "Those are nice, mate. Can I have them?" Obviously, I said no firmly but not aggressively, then said thanks and told him about the fact I got them on sale. He said, "Can I touch them?" which was immediately a big red flag. I politely declined, and he started rubbing my shoe anyway. Then in one swift movement, he grabbed my ankle, pulled my entire leg up to his face, and put the entire toe of my size 11 Converses in his mouth. At which point, while sitting in stunned silence, I started desperately looking around, and I see the hospital police walking over. The officer asks if we were here together. He said yes. I said no. The officer then asked if he was a patient. I said yes. He said no. I told the officer I was just waiting for my taxi, and the guy rambled something I couldn't really make out to the officer, who suggested he move along. The guy stood up, gave me a handshake, and walked off into the night. The officer obviously asked if I was okay, and I told him what happened. He was just as confused as I was. After that, my taxi was due in 5 minutes, so I went and stood on the opposite side of the hospital where the taxi rank was. I asked some friends what he could have been on, and they unanimously said meth, and the shoe thing was probably just a fetish. More than 10 years ago, when I was still a student, I used to make extra money by doing house sitting. One day, a couple contacted me and asked if I could stay at their house for a few days and look after their dog while they were away on a trip. Their previous sitter had canceled, and they didn't want their dog left alone. They offered to pay me for the full 2 weeks, even though I would only be staying for a few days. So I agreed. I picked up the keys, packed my things, and headed over to the house. It was already after 5 p.m., and the sun was starting to go down. The house was in a nice neighborhood, but the area was known for break-ins and robberies. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I was young, and I honestly believed nothing bad would happen to me. The first few days went completely normal. I spent my time relaxing, watching movies, and taking care of the dog. Everything felt comfortable, and I had no reason to think anything was wrong. The owners were supposed to return on the 5th day, but around 10 p.m., they called me. Their flight had been delayed, and they told me they would stay at a hotel for the night and drive back the next morning. They asked if I could stay one more night. I didn't mind. I was already there and had my things with me. Before going to bed, I called my dad to let him know about the change of plans. For some reason, he asked me for the address. I normally wouldn't have thought much about it, but looking back now, that one question probably saved my life. I eventually went to sleep around 1 a.m. The house was completely quiet. The only sounds were the usual nighttime noises, and I remember feeling completely relaxed. Then suddenly I woke up. A window had shattered somewhere in the house. For a few seconds I stayed still, trying to understand what had happened. Then I heard footsteps. Someone was moving through the hallway. My entire body went alert. I grabbed my phone and immediately called my dad. Since he was the last person I had called, I only had to press one button to redial. I didn't speak. I just placed the phone between the mattress and the headboard, hoping that if my dad answered, he would hear what was happening. I had barely done that when my bedroom door opened. A man stepped inside. The room was dark, and I could only see his shape, but I noticed something in his hand. A knife. When he saw me, he raised it and started walking toward me. I didn't have time to think. I pulled my legs back and waited until he got close enough, then kicked as hard as I could. The force of the kick sent him flying backward into the wall, and the knife slipped from his hand. Before he could get up, I was already on top of him. I knew I couldn't let him recover. I hit him until he stopped moving. Then, for a moment, everything went silent, until I heard the sound of a gun being loaded. I froze. Another man was standing there with a pistol pointed at me. The fear hit me instantly. I remember feeling completely numb, just staring at the gun and thinking about what could happen next. He kept the pistol aimed at me for a few seconds before telling me to get on the bed and lie face down. I was terrified, but I realized something. If he wanted to shoot me, he already would have. So I did what he said. He threw a blanket over me, and I turned onto my side with my back against the wall. I kept my arms and legs in front of me, hoping that if they tried to hurt me, I would have some way to protect myself. At that point, I had forgotten that my phone was still connected. I also had no idea what was happening with the first man I had knocked down. Then I heard someone else enter the room. There were now 3 of them inside the house. I couldn't understand everything they were saying, but one of them sounded like he was speaking Portuguese. While one of them helped the injured man, the others started searching through the house, opening drawers and collecting anything valuable they could find. I stayed completely still under the blanket, listening to every movement around me. Then suddenly I heard tires outside. A car was approaching quickly. The sound got louder until the vehicle stopped near the gate. Then I heard someone shouting. It was my dad. The moment the men heard my dad outside, they panicked. I could hear them moving quickly through the house. They rushed out through the back door and tried to escape over the fence. My dad got out of the car and fired a few shots in their direction. I knew he wasn't trying to hit them. He was trying to scare them and stop them from getting away. I grabbed the house keys and opened the gate for him. The second my dad walked inside and saw me, he rushed over. He grabbed me and hugged me tightly, asking if I was okay. I remember trying to answer him, but I was still shaking and couldn't really process what had just happened. He looked me over, making sure I wasn't injured, then told me that we were getting out of there and that I was safe. Only then did I realize how close I had come to not making it out. My dad called the police while we waited outside near the car. The police took over an hour to arrive. By then, I had started to calm down, and that's when I suddenly remembered the dog. I hadn't seen her since everything started. I grabbed a flashlight and began searching around the yard. The night was still dark and quiet, and after everything that had happened, walking around that house felt unreal. Then, near the corner of the yard, I saw her. She was lying on the ground. She was dead. Later, the police found pieces of meat near the fence that had been poisoned. The men had used it to silence the dog before breaking into the house. That was the part that affected me the most. The police took our statements and collected some evidence, but they didn't seem very interested in what had happened. By the time everything was finished, the sun was starting to come up. I grabbed my things, locked the house as best as I could, and went home with my dad. Only after we got back did he tell me his side of what happened. He said that when he answered my call, he didn't hear me speaking. All he heard was shouting and what sounded like a fight happening in the background. When I didn't respond, he immediately knew something was wrong. Because he had asked for the address earlier, he knew exactly where I was. He drove there as quickly as he could and stayed on the phone the entire time until he reached the gate. The call had lasted just over 7 minutes. A few months later, the detective contacted me and told me they had caught the men involved. She asked me to come to the police station to identify them. I told her I couldn't recognize their faces. It was dark, and after the man pointed the gun at me, I spent most of the time hiding under the blanket. She explained they already had other evidence connecting them to the crime. When I arrived at the station, they brought 3 men into the room. One of them immediately stood out. It was the man I had fought with. The moment he saw me, he looked at me with a level of hatred I had never seen before. He raised his hand to his neck and made a gesture like he was cutting his throat. Later, the detective showed me his criminal record. He had been involved in multiple violent crimes, including murder, attempted murder, robbery, and assault. She told me that if I hadn't stopped him quickly that night, things could have ended very differently. A few days later, the detective called again. This time, she warned me that the man had escaped custody. For a while, I worried he might come looking for me, but nothing happened. About 2 years later, I ran into the detective by chance. We talked about the case, and she told me that the man had eventually died during another home invasion. He had broken into the wrong house. The homeowner was waiting for him and fought back. He was shot and died before emergency services arrived. That night changed the way I looked at the world. I became much more careful. I started checking doors and locks more often and paying attention to my surroundings. Even years later, I still sometimes wake up at night when I hear strange noises. Because once you've experienced something like that, it's hard to ever feel completely safe again. This happened when I was about 10 years old. Every summer, I went to a summer camp for children and teenagers. They had all kinds of activities like kayaking, canoeing, and swimming. The camp had 2 main buildings. One was for the girls' dormitories and showers, and the other was for the boys. There was also a small forest with a long path leading to the lake, where the canoes were kept along the shore. Since I went there every year, I already knew a lot of people. The counselors knew me well too. I was a social kid, so whenever someone new arrived, I was usually the first person to talk to them. I was especially close with a girl named Lila. We were always together. We did everything as a pair, but I also spent time with the other kids. Then one summer, a new girl arrived. She was tall, extremely tall for her age. She was pale, blonde, and very thin. She barely spoke. She never smiled, never looked at anyone, and always stayed away from the other kids. I felt bad for her, so one day after lunch I decided to talk to her. I introduced myself and told her about the camp, the activities, and what we would be doing the next day. When I finished speaking, she slowly stood up, looked directly into my eyes, and said, "You talk too much. We should sew your mouth shut." I laughed because I didn't know how else to react. But deep down, I was scared. I told Lila what happened, and she laughed it off. But something about that girl bothered me. The other kids felt the same way. Since nobody knew her name, we started calling her the Long Girl. The rest of the camp continued normally. We went hiking, swimming, kayaking, and spent time around the lake. There were also older teenagers there, around 16 or 17 years old. Strangely, the Long Girl spent most of her time with them instead of kids her own age. At night, she would return to the dorm very late, sometimes around 3 a.m. I always had trouble sleeping, so I could hear when she came back, and every time I heard the door open, I felt uneasy. One night, I had a nightmare. In the dream, she was standing above me while I slept, holding something and preparing to sew my mouth shut. I woke up suddenly, my mouth completely dry. I couldn't move. Above me was Lila sleeping in the bunk bed. I wanted to call her name, but I couldn't make a sound. The long girl's bed was beside mine. She was lying with her back turned toward me. After what felt like an hour, I slowly turned around. She was awake. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. The moonlight coming through the curtains barely lit her face. The room was completely silent. There was also a strange smell in the air, something like salt and damp wood. I immediately closed my eyes. Eventually, I fell asleep. 2 days later, we had a big swimming activity planned. The camp was almost over. Around 50 kids were in the lake, split into different groups. I was with Lila and some other friends. They were jumping off a small rock while I stayed in the water because I was starting to feel dizzy. Then I noticed the long girl. She was with the older teenagers again. At that moment, I was alone in the water. She slowly came toward me. She had a strange smile on her face. Her lips looked dry, and her eyes seemed different from before. She told me to follow her. I don't know why I listened. We moved farther into the lake until I couldn't touch the bottom anymore. I immediately felt uncomfortable. She whispered something that I couldn't understand. Then, without warning, she grabbed my head and pushed me underwater. Her hands were wrapped tightly around my head. I fought as hard as I could, but I was only 10 years old. I couldn't get away. The water became blurry. Everything around me turned blue and green. My arms became weak. I remember feeling like I was going to fall asleep, like I was just going to stop fighting. Then suddenly, someone grabbed me and pulled me back to the surface. It was a teenager. I don't remember everything clearly, but I remember seeing many people around me. The long girl was already swimming back toward the shore. A pale figure surrounded by everyone else. They pulled me out of the water. After that, everything is blurry. Lila was talking to me. My friends were asking if I was okay. A 15-year-old girl dried me with a towel. I remember her hands feeling strangely cold. The weirdest part was that nobody told the instructors what happened. Nobody confronted the long girl. The next day we left the camp, but when I got on the bus, she wasn't there. Years later, I stayed in contact with Lila and some of the other kids. Recently, Lila told me the girl's name was Angelique. She also told me that Angelique had serious psychological problems and that some people already knew she was dangerous. I still don't know exactly what happened that summer. Maybe she wanted to hurt me. Maybe she didn't understand what she was doing, but I still remember the way she looked at me underwater. The strangest part isn't that she tried to drown me. It's that after everything happened, nobody said anything. Nobody asked questions. Everyone just acted like it was something that should be forgotten. But I was 10 years old, and I never forgot that moment. Even now, whenever I see a lake or hear someone talking about summer camps, I think about that day. It was a small town, but I don't remember exactly where. I was 10 years old at the time. I'm 28 now, and even after all these years, I still remember that day clearly. It was my birthday, and my parents took me to McDonald's to celebrate. I was excited because, as a kid, getting my own meal felt like a big deal. While I was standing at the ordering kiosk, I noticed a man in his 30s watching me. At first, I thought it was strange, but I tried not to think too much about it. When we sat down at our table, I looked around and saw him again. He was still staring at me. I started feeling uncomfortable and leaned closer to my mom. "Mom, that guy keeps looking at me." She glanced over and shook her head. "You're imagining it. He's not looking at you." I looked back at him, and for a moment he wasn't staring. I started thinking maybe my mom was right, but as soon as I turned away I could feel his eyes on me again. A few minutes later, I needed to use the bathroom. I told my mom, and she told me to go ahead. I walked inside and entered one of the stalls. The bathroom was quiet. A few seconds later, I heard the door open. Someone walked in. Then I heard a man's voice. "Is this stall free?" I froze for a second. "No, sorry, you can use another one." There was a pause. Then he started laughing. At first, it was just a strange laugh, but then it got louder. He started hitting the stall door. I didn't know what to do. I was only 10 years old, and I was completely terrified. I backed away from the door and curled up, hoping he would leave. The banging continued for what felt like forever. Then suddenly it stopped. I stayed completely still, waiting. But instead of leaving, I heard him laughing again. Then I saw movement near the bottom of the stall. He slowly lowered himself down and pushed his fingers through the gap between the door and the floor. My heart dropped. Then his face appeared. It was the same man who had been watching me outside. I started crying. He reached his hand toward my feet, trying to grab me. I reacted without thinking. I kicked as hard as I could, hitting him in the face. Instead of getting angry, he just laughed harder. Then I heard another voice, a man shouting, "Hey, get away from him!" I immediately recognized the voice. It was my father. The man pulled back, and I heard my dad yelling for someone to stop him. I rushed out of the stall, and my father grabbed me and pulled me close. A police officer happened to be nearby and ran over after hearing the shouting. He quickly detained the man and called for backup. About 10 minutes later, more officers arrived and asked me what happened. I explained everything that had happened inside the bathroom. After a few days later, we got an update from the police. They told us the man was already wanted for assault and attacks against children. He had previously worked as a babysitter but was fired after multiple complaints were made against him. Even now, I still think about how lucky I was that day. I was just a kid celebrating my birthday, and a simple trip to McDonald's almost turned into something much worse.